Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of the Mercy One Cancer Center and the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. And you may not know this, but November is National Family Caregiver Month. And in honor of that, we have a colleague and friend of mine, Kathy Koenig, as our guest. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So Kathy is a counselor and is our caregiver counselor at the Mercy One Richard Deming Cancer Center. So we get a chance to work together and share patients. And so thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a privilege.
So before we talk about counseling in general and caregiver counseling specifically, let's get to know you a little bit. Where did you grow up?
Homegrown here in Des Moines, Iowa.
Right here in Des Moines, Iowa.
I did not stray far for school. I went to Iowa State. I was not allowed back in the day to go to the University of Iowa because it was too wild.
Too wild
there.
and liberal. So when you went to Iowa State, what was your first declared major?
English.
Okay.
For about 2 quarters.
And then you switched to
eventually to a social work and sociology major.
Okay. And then I know you have your master's degree. Did you go directly on to your master's or did you work in the field for a while?
No, I worked in foster care for a few years, and right out of school, I actually went from an internship my senior year and got a job. They hired me, so I went right into that here in Des Moines. And then I worked there for a little while, and then I worked at now Unity Point for several years, starting out in the ICU, CCU. So I went, right into the deep end of healthcare, and eventually moved out of that and eventually into adolescent medicine.
Okay.
And that's when I got my master's degree in counseling.
And so your job when you were at Unity Point in the intensive care units, were you primarily working with the families?
Yes.
As opposed to the patient?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I was the medical social worker, and my job was to help educate them, support them, get them the information they needed, and help move things on, or handle just the support if somebody died.
And so I know as a medical social worker and a counselor, you've got the talent and skills to, counsel pretty much anyone. When did you realize that this whole caregiver counseling was something that you had a passion for?
I think that the passion or the purpose came together when I really stepped into the roles of being a family caregiver. I worked with lots of family caregivers through the years. That was part of my work. But when I was doing caregiving for my father over a period of time, who had a chronic illness with COPD, and then a very short, intense time as a long-distance caregiver with my husband for his sister out on the eastern shore of Virginia. It was that summer of flying back and forth and dealing with, we were well-versed in how to do things, and trying to make those type of connections in a different part of the country with different resources was really challenging. And as we were flying back and forth, I thought, I need to do something to make this easier for other people. If this is hard for me, if this is hard for us, I've got to find a way to make that easier. So that's really what prompted me.
This.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, and as anyone who's gone through the cancer journey knows, cancer is really a family journey. An individual who has cancer doesn't journey alone. There's family members, friends, other people that help, and they have particular needs. Before we talk more about the counseling specifically, let's do a little definition of terms. So this concept of caregiver, that's a word that maybe means different things to different people. So some people think of it as like the professional caregiver, like a doctor and or a nurse or a social worker are caregivers. In the context of what we are calling you a caregiver counselor, we're referring to lay caregivers, family members. Maybe talk a little bit more about that term and some other terms that might accurately describe that role that this person, this lay caregiver, plays.
Yeah, it's an important distinction. And interestingly, lately, I've been seeing more written about the resistance to people identifying as a caregiver, as a family caregiver or care partner. And so I use those terms. Sometimes it will depend on who I'm working with, that I will use specifically the term care partner. Sometimes it's a caregiver, depending on what's happening in the relationship. But a lot of people are resistant to identifying themselves as a caregiver because they'll say, listen, this is my spouse, this is my role, this is, or I'm a daughter, and so this is just what we do.
Does. This is what your daughter does. This is what a friend does.
Yes, this is just what we do. This is what we do in my family. And so we don't need a title for it. And sometimes when we begin to create those distinctions, it's sometimes hard for people because it connotes sometimes an imbalance of power in a relationship, and particularly maybe a parent-child. That's particularly true in parent-child relationships where somebody becomes a caregiver, particularly with somebody who may have a cognitive problem, and then you're starting to take over a lot of decisions for them, and it feels very uncomfortable. Or there's that sense even for somebody who may not have cognitive impairment, but you're making some choices for them or saying, no, this is what we're going to do, or trying to urge them into things that it's like, hey, you're not the boss of me. But it creates a difficulty in relationships. It changes the relationship, and sometimes say somebody needs a lot of caregiving during a cancer event, over the months that might go on. And then there's a recovery period or there's a plateau. And how do we give that power back? How do we say, okay, now you're in charge? Or how does the person sort of wrest their independence and power back?
And as you describe this imbalance of power, but we also know that it can be incredibly difficult to be the spouse, the friend, the person who doesn't have cancer, who is providing this service to their loved one or friend. And many times the spouse who doesn't have cancer feels like, I don't have cancer, I just need to give it all of myself to this person. And they don't want to burden their spouse who has cancer with issues that normally spouses would give and take and help each other along the journey.
Yeah, I see and I hear a lot of that very often a care partner or caregiving spouse will feel a level of loneliness or isolation within the relationship, because normally we would make these decisions together, or something's going on with me and I want to share that with them, but they're going through their stuff and decide their stuff is more or less. And so there's these weights that are given to things. And at times, it's like your partner may not be able to, they might be so encumbered with their own situation. I don't know if that's the right word, but they don't have the energy to take yours on. So it can be very lonely. And it might be decisions that you're thinking of that you can't just talk to a friend about.
And unfortunately, sometimes they feel so burdened by time constraints and the desire to just give it their all that they don't even want to take time to see a counselor for themselves. That they feel like that's a luxury that they can't afford.
Yeah.
And I don't mean cost-wise. Our caregiver counseling services are provided free of charge, but that they feel like it's a luxury of taking time away from their spouse to do something for themselves.
Yes. And I find that to be probably one of the trickiest things in other settings where I've provided those types of services, or it's like people sometimes can't come to a group, or they can't come to something because they have to take care of somebody, or something has come up. I got a couple texts today of people saying, I need to change my appointment because now my sister's appointment is on this date. Can we find another date? And that happens somewhat routinely. And I'm fine with that, because I get that there's just this sort of rolling, band of appointments that happen. So sometimes too, I'm working with some people by phone or by Zoom. Some people are ill themselves or been not well, and so they can't come in. And so I just try to be as flexible as I can with
So I'm
it.
interested how the conversation starts because, again, the folks that we send to you are not the individuals with cancer. They're the ones that are helping their loved one with their cancer journey, but they're coming to see you because their loved one has cancer, but yet you're focusing on them. To what extent do you learn from them? Obviously, you're integrated in our clinic, so you know about their loved one's cancer from my notes.
Mhm.
But in the act of getting to know the caregiver as your client, how much time do you spend on the actual story of the person who has cancer?
We spend a little bit of time on that story. And when somebody first comes to me or I first reach out to them, I let them know I'm their person. That very often when somebody say, "Oh, how are you?" It's like the subtext is, "How is your person?" And it's not, "How are you?" And so I'm very, "How are you?" And I let them know because I'm adjacent from the clinic staff. I don't have access to the medical record.
I see. So you
So
don't
I
see
don't know.
my note
Oh, I do not know.
about the
But if I
patient.
think something's but usually I get like at least a diagnosis when I get a and then if I have a question, I might go to you or I might go to one of the nurses and say, "Is there something I need to know?" And but very often that history just comes forth. I would much rather, for the most part, hear it, the story or what the care partner experiences and what their story about it is, and then their relationship into it. And then they also know I'm also not putting anything into the medical record, that this is their time and what's said here stays here. And so it's very often, I think, I let them know this isn't therapy. I am a therapist, like technically, but this is not what I'm doing. And there's no diagnoses, yay, or anything like that. So they're free to just kind of talk. And so they do, I find.
What are some of the common themes that caregivers talk about? So, I mean, it is a self-selected group, so we offer your services to many more people than take us up on your services. So those that do choose to see you have said, yeah, I think I would like to see someone.
I think sometimes there's when people first come, and some people will come for only one session and that's fine, and some people for many sessions, and I'm good with whatever. And I think sometimes people want to know, am I doing okay? Is there something I should be doing differently? Am I somehow off balance with something?
So they
Caregivers tend
still
to,
might be focused on, am I doing a good job?
am I
of
doing a good
caregiving?
job? Yeah. Caregivers are perpetually plagued with guilt over something or nothing, or not nothing, but what feels like something. And so sometimes reassuring that this is you're doing great. And they might say, "Yeah, I think that this was enough." And then they go on their way, and other people are like, "Can I make another appointment?" And it's like, "Yes, indeed." And so, and within the context of what I do a fair amount of grief support within caregiving. I think I'm a bit of a unicorn in that. I work with a lot of grief professionals, and nobody else is really sort of focused on caregiving. But there's never a time when I say, "Well, there's some grief built into this." Nobody says, "Oh, I have no idea what you're talking about." Like they'll go, "Yes,"
because we're really just to clarify. I think you're referring to what I might call anticipatory grief. That the person with cancer hasn't died yet, but the caregiver is already grieving the loss of the relationship as it was before cancer, the loss of some social interactions, and kind of preparing anticipatory grief of their death.
Yeah. Whether that's going to happen or not, it's on the table. I mean, it's just probably never not. And so I am sort of the queen of handouts. So I usually have written material to send with them because it's overwhelming to get so much information or to share so much. There's so much vulnerability in that I also think by sharing some resources with them, they understand like, oh, I'm not the only one. Because I think I'm making up these stories. And when I can offer them some information that they can take with them, I think that that's generally helpful. And I think there's just so many phases of grief, and it is. Some of it's anticipatory. Sometimes it's ambiguous grief. And ambiguous grief can exist in situations where the person might be altered to a degree. I think of something like, say, a brain tumor, which can alter somebody's cognition or their ability to speak or their ability to interact. And they're there, but they're not quite the same. And it changes, once again, that balance of care, but also missing someone who is still here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And being able to put language to it, I think, is sometimes helpful for people because it's like that, oh, that's what I'm experiencing.
I'm wondering if the caregivers ever express anger or feeling like this is not what I signed up for, and I've just my whole life given away now to this other person.
Sometimes, and I'm honestly pleased when somebody is that vulnerable, that they feel safe enough to say that. Because it's a feeling. It's a feeling, and all the feelings are legitimate. And anger is its own standalone. Sometimes anger is sitting on top of fear. Mm-hmm. And so if we can explore one, then maybe we can explore what's underneath, because sometimes it is that, is this ever going to change? Is this going to get better? And where did my life go? And I'm putting things on hold, and now I don't have a social life, or people just being angry that their perceived role by other people is now defined as, oh, he's a caregiver. And it's like, wait, I'm still this, I'm still that. Much like I would say to a cancer patient that there's a wholeness to all of us, and we have many roles, and to have like something slapped on our foreheads that like
the label,
yeah. You're a patient, you're a caregiver, you're a care partner. It's like that is a part, and then there's the whole. And what I try to help people do, I think, is to so much of healthcare and when we get a diagnosis or something happens, our lives tend to contract, and they contract around this specific event. And now there's all this new language to learn and new people, and the other parts of your life tend to get put to the side, and so there's loss there. And so sometimes if I can help people create spaciousness, like this is this thing that's now moved in. We didn't invite it. It's not the most welcome of guests, but we can find room for it. And how do we incorporate it? How do we include it as part of the lived experience and befriend it? And then at some points in time, as you know, people will have, go into remission. So it's like, okay, now you go off to the shed, stay there. I'm getting back to my life, my new life.
Other common themes.
I think that there's fatigue. There's a lot of fatigue because there's just so much going and keeping track of. And people become extraordinary with spreadsheets and EOBs and all of the insurance stuff and trying to keep on top of that. There's the financial worries. There's tons of financial concerns that come up in healthcare and in illness and particularly if the caregiver care partner has had to set aside their own job and they've had to quit their job, they are now also losing money for their retirement. Like it impacts at several levels. So those are a couple of things that we kind of talk about. I try to help people find whatever resources I can to help shore things up.
And then you also provide true grief counseling for individuals when their loved one dies, and then you will still meet with them
Yeah.
And how would you say, what are some of the differences of counseling someone, being with someone who's got the issues of anticipatory grief versus, okay, now the death has happened and there's some aspect of grieving that just can't be dealt with until the death happens?
Right. I think what we know in some of the grief work that I do and others do, that I don't know, a more recent statistic was maybe about 50% of people will go through some form of anticipatory grief, sort of begin to imagine what will happen or what life will be like, which is sometimes what I will work with somebody in a caregiving experience, kind of beginning to imagine life after caregiving. Because sometimes if they don't, it comes to this halt, and then people are like, what now? What now? And there can be guilt. There can be so much guilt about the anticipatory stuff. Like, it's not happening. You're not creating it. You're not making it happen. But what would that be like?
Talking about it does not bring it up.
No. But what to a person, what they will say is like, I thought by anticipating it, I would understand it, and it's a whole different entity to a person. They have said that, and so I have utter respect for whatever that bereavement then becomes.
And obviously, everyone is different, and every relationship is different. But maybe give a sort of averages when someone loses, let's say, a spouse, and that it's something that we see coming. So it comes from a cancer that goes through a phase of progression of slow deterioration, and you see the death coming, as opposed to, just a car accident out of the blue with someone who's healthy. What's a reasonable amount of time for someone to be in maybe what I would call active grieving? Maybe you have better terms for that, because some aspect of grief, goes on forever.
Yep.
And it's just reminiscing and remembering and bittersweetness and different things. But there is this active grieving that can just brings the world to a stop.
Right. It's maybe what I would use the word is acute. It's like it's a very grieving, acute thing that's happened, and now this event has happened, and now there has been an end, and depending on how that was, I'll get into a little bit more, but I think there's this, like, now I have to have this service, or we're going to put this service off for a while. And sometimes I've heard from funeral directors that putting it off for a long time can actually create more distress for people, because they keep changing the plan, because they keep worried that they're not doing it right, or they're not doing it enough.
Do it perfectly.
And I'm a fan of people doing multiple memorials if they want, like, on certain birthdays or events, like we can do another small thing with an intimate group of people, another, remembrance, when you actually have the time and energy to remember, because so many people are just like in a fog. So sometimes when I see people, they're just like coming out of the fog. And I think it's important to understand people need to tell the story, and they will tell the story over and over, and you think, like, well, I've already heard that. But if you really listen, they're not telling the same story over and over. The story is there, but there will be different bits of it that come out, because we're trying to kind of knit it back together, make sense of it, and see it in a certain way, maybe hold it. What can get tricky is when there is this concept that we talk about in grief counseling called hindsight bias. It's what we would call a 20/20 vision. And it's like, oh, if only I had done that. Oh, if only I had called the doctor. Should I have taken him to the ER? What should we have done? Oh, if I'd done this wouldn't have happened. Things that may or may not have had any sort of bearing, or that maybe the patient wouldn't have even wanted. But we're trying to manage our distress. So there's a lot of times just like help, and very often people like, when am I going to get over this? And when is this going to stop hurting? And it's sometimes really hard for me to say, I don't have a Band-Aid. I can't tell you. And that it's going to be what it's going to be, and to just hold somebody in that space for a while.
So,
But then, it does move.
it does.
It does move.
It
It
does.
does
And
move.
then there are processes that can help
Mhm.
move that. So, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler work together with the different, sort of stages. And he came out with a book not too long ago, adding another stage, and that stage is meaning.
Mhm.
And that maybe one thing that can be healthy is to think of kind of meaning and purpose. What was the meaning of this person's life, and how did their life maybe impact and provide meaning to your life? And that can provide a sense of solace as you think back. It's not just a life that's gone poof, but that the meaning and purpose of that life can continue on and maybe help provide some sense of speeding up that really miserable feeling of grieving, to allow time for some sweetness along with the bitter.
Yeah. It can kind of, Band-Aid a little bit of, that just brokenheartedness, so that then your heart can kind of begin to open up a little bit to those remembrances. I think sometimes, particularly too, in those phases of acute grief, and it still can happen beyond that, but particularly in the early days, I hear so often from people that they are really afraid to go out. The grocery store is one place. Sometimes churches, they will go to a different church because they don't want to see people they know, because they don't want people to look at them or talk to them or hug them. They might want that, but they're not sure they want that. But they're so afraid that they're going to start crying or feel like they're going to lose control, that it's, you feel so out of control at that time, that I think that's also the other piece is, when am I going to get back in control? I'm very Humpty Dumptied, and I need to be put back together again. And for some people, some of that grieving particularly if it's been a lengthier, some of that grieving has occurred over time. And so I think it's really important to not be too comparative and say, oh, she doesn't seem unhappy at all. We all grieve very, very differently. I've had a lot of people well, she's laughing and smiling now, so I think she's fine. And it's like, the insides and the outsides don't always match.
Right. And some people are more demonstrative, and others are just do it in.
Yeah, they go home and
so this is November, and we got, the big holidays coming up, the big family gathering holidays. And that can be stressful. I mean, for anyone, whether you have a diagnosis of anything or cancer, but sometimes families that are going through the cancer journey, either the patient or the caregiver, might have some particular stresses around this whole expectation of the holidays.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about some of the added pressures that can happen. I mean, I think there can be some added comfort and joy that comes with holidays,
right.
but there can be some increased stress.
Yes. I mean, you make the good point that, and I used to hear this in my therapy practice years ago. It would come up in July. It was like, the holidays are coming. It's like, which one? It's like Christmas. It's like, we have time. But it's like, what parts of those? So yeah, we can have it, but this adds, I think, additional, maybe some unique stressors. I recently did an online program, a little webinar about holiday stress and managing that for people who are caregivers or in grief. And there will be some resources in the show notes that you as an audience can access from my Tiny New website, about some resources that have some supportive things. And one of the things that particularly came out of that webinar, we really went for quite a while, were some communication tools. So I'll just back up for a minute. That as these holidays are approaching, it's, I think, wise to say, reflect on so what kind of meaning do they have? Did we always travel and that's not that's not possible this year. What do we do instead? Do people come to us? Do we want people to come to us? Are we stable enough to that? Are we in kind of an acute treatment phase?
Are we immunosuppressed and we
Yeah.
don't want to be at a big
Exactly.
gathering?
Or if somebody's saying, you can come to my house, and say, okay, thank you. But also, as part of the communication around that, you may not know what that day or that week is going to be like. I mean, I hear from enough people like, oh, it's the 1 week that we're off, chemo. And so they live a lot of life during that week before they're back on. But it could be a chemo week when they're just not up to it, or can't eat certain things, or just, worried about, being, or just, is the home that I'm being invited to accessible for me? We made some adaptations to my house last year when my brother was ill, so he could come to Christmas, and that they were easy to do. We were happy to do them, but it was like, okay, it's going to be harder for him to be mobile, or we need to give them the garage, not have them try to walk from the street. And sometimes it's simple things like that can make a difference, and they're doable. But it may be that you don't feel up to it, and having the ability to on a couple of points, say, for this year, for this month, for this day, I'm going to do it differently. For this year, temporize it. So it's not like forever, that's it, I'm never doing things with you again, unless that's really what you want, but let's just keep it temporary. And then to communicate, I'm not sure how I'll feel that day. Do you need to know now? Can I get in touch with you later? And if you can't, somebody is not well enough to come, but they had planned to come, then the people who are hosting, can you make a side plan of like, how can we take food to them? How can we take a small gift to them? If it's a family gathering, like, get a bunch of cards, like not just one card, but as many cards as you can gather, so that everybody writes on their own card. So the cards also get delivered along with the meal. So it's like, oh, we are remembered, we are included, because there is that sense of isolation.
Right.
But
I mean, the last thing someone needs is you've decided to go somewhere, and then you can't go, and then you get this guilt trip, like, oh, but we made your favorite side dish. And
right. Yeah. Or, I mean, you can, it's like, we'll bring you food, or can we do a video call with you so we can see you? What's a good time for you? And if somebody is undergoing treatment and they have a rhythm to their day when they're, not napping or whatever, and, it's like, it's, if you can be accommodating and say, yeah, we will have dinner at a different time, and everyone needs to settle down, that we're not doing it the old time. And, because we can get worked up over somebody's casserole dish. So,
yeah. So one of the burdens that I know some caregivers, and mostly I'm thinking of spouses, but they feel like they also have to keep everyone informed, and that everybody wants to know all the medical details, and to the point that it becomes a burden to try to keep everyone informed. Do you ever have caregivers that you work with that express that concern, and what are some ideas that you explore with them that might relieve the stress?
Yeah. Actually, I have a lovely younger caregiver who is a care partner with her parents. And so she is a young adult who does young adult things. She works, and she has friends, and she has lovely friends, and they're interested in what's going on with her parents. But not long ago, she shared with me, like, I just don't want to talk about this all the time. I don't want to enter the conversation with, like, how's my, my parents this or that. And so this is where I think having allies in your care experience, like somebody who can be kind of your wing person, and that's in the family, or friends going out. And she contacted a friend ahead of time and said, I'm looking forward to going out. I just want to have an easy evening, and I don't want to talk about my parents or whatever, my dad and whatever. It's good. Like, if things are stable, if there's a problem, I'll let you know. I just want to go out and be be with you all. And which I loved. I loved that she sort of set that boundary for herself, or that agreement with her friends. I also think that, you know, if I'm the person who's got an illness, this is just me, but I think it's, you know, relative to a lot of people, I want some control over what's being reported about me, because I don't want to be talked about, and I don't want to be reduced to an illness or symptoms. And how much do you want shared, and with whom do you want it shared? You may not want this to be like telephone, and then it gets so distorted. So it's, I think also like how much do we say, and how much do we, and with whom? And some people will use systems like, I'm blocking on the name, but there are websites where you can.
Right, the Caring Bridge.
Yes.
One of the
yes. So,
common ones.
Yeah, in fact, I just got one from a friend I know in Colorado about his mom today, and that's helpful. But, you know, wasn't super detailed. She fell, she went back to the hospital. We'll keep you updated. Good. That's all we need to know.
Any other particular stresses that come at the holiday time? And
I think sometimes too, there's that sense of, there's if you're somebody who always hosted, like I always hosted, and now is that another loss that I'm having if I can't do that, or not being able to go, or not being able to travel or see grandchildren? Those are things that can sometimes come up that, you know, can we do things at a different time? Can we do it on a different day? How flexible can we be about this? I think that there are the times when you realize, and I had the experience with my father at a Christmas holiday of knowing that was his last Christmas.
Yeah.
Everybody in my family denied it, and I'm like, yeah, this was it. And so knowing that, it was, you know, very bittersweet for me. And
there's that last Christmas, and then there's the first Christmas without.
And that was a year that, because I had been super close to my dad, and I had been very much his care partner. He lived independently and alone up till really the very end. So I was his medical care partner and had to, you know, be in charge of lots of those decisions, sometimes that were really hard. But like he died in March. But by summer, I was just like, you know, like, it was like I was walking through concrete, you know. It's like I didn't care. It's like I could think ahead to like, oh, the holidays are coming, and I don't care. And I told my husband and my daughter this, and they were like, okay, that's fine, whatever you want. And at some point, it became a conversation with my brother and sister-in-law, and they said, oh, we'll host. Great, you know. And so we shared that back and forth for several years, and that allowed me to get beyond that. And we always, I mean, somebody's always talking about my dad at 20 some years later at a holiday, because he was just the kind of person you wanted there.
And I would assume now there's just so much more sweetness. And it's
there's just so much joy in it now.
Even when a tear comes to your eyes. I mean, my mom and dad died 40 some years ago, and you know, every once in a while, just sort of think of them. And sometimes I was with my brother and sister last weekend, and we were reminiscing. And so it's not a dreadful agony, but there's this ennui, this bittersweetness that, but mostly it's the fact that you're remembering someone that you loved, and that feels good, but it may bring a tear to the eye.
Yeah.
Well, very good. You know what? I think we're going to open up to questions now.
I was going to share one more thing. That this is also something. Two things. I had someone ask me the other day and say, "Well, are you going to do anything?" Like, I think after that webinar, you know, are you going to do anything at the beginning of the year to kind of like, how do we sort of let go of the holidays? How do we start moving
Gives
beyond?
Us an opportunity that year, that December 31st,
Yeah.
January 1st. It's like, yes,
and
remake myself.
And it's it's something I already had planned. So when somebody asked about it, I was like, yes, in fact, I am going to do. I've got some stuff on deck about that, because I think we get caught up in like, oh, I have to set all these new intentions or all these things that are going to fall by the wayside. I honestly think that's better left till March, till we're into spring. I think that winter is really a reflective time. And it's like, and so there's some releasing and letting go. And how do we do that? And one of the things that I'm planning to do, having learned this from one of my grief colleagues, is to help people with sort of their memorializing, curating items of their loved ones. Like, we're all curators. We do not have to be we don't have to have a gallery. We could do it in this room and everyone could bring us something.
You don't necessarily have to set up a temple or altar.
No. But you could have your little altar at home, and that altar might be a vase of flowers, and it might be some little tchotchke, and so I've got some ideas and some plans that I think are going to be helpful for people and interesting and enlivening.
I like that idea of a spring intention. That's really the new year in the sense of biology and ecology, and you're right that maybe January and February is the time to be thinking and contemplating and reflecting, and then have your intentions, your new resolutions, if you will, come with spring.
Right. They're ready to be born then. They can, those seeds can be planted then. And then it's like nature. Then there's more, then they grow over the next few months. There's harvesting. But instead of this thing, it's like, it doesn't make sense to do that. It's artificial. So.
Well, let's open up questions. So anything to do with any stresses that either the patients or the family members are going through? Boone.
This is not about stress. It's about your website. Can you give us that address?
Yes. It's a brand new baby website. I'm abandoning my old one, and I'm birthing something new. I hope it's a toddler by spring. But it's www.kathykoenig.com.
And Kathy's with K.
KATHYKOEN. How do I spell my name? NIG.com.
So KATHYKOENIG.com.
Yes.
All right.
And if anybody's looking for some of the care partnering, caregiving resources that can be helpful during the season, or the care partnering grief resources, there's a new freebie handout. So we'll send that to you. We'll send that to your email address. I promise, I'm not selling your email address to anyone. I don't know how to do that stuff, and I don't believe in it. So. And
the other would be that if you want to meet with Kathy, she's available through the Mercy One Richard Deming Cancer Center. So. Yeah.
So you can email me. Oh.
And you brought a book with you. We haven't touched on that yet.
This is sort of like a little Bible that I share with a lot of my clients, and several of them have purchased it. And this book came out last year. It's called Hope for the Best, Plan for the Rest: 7 Keys for Navigating a Life-Changing Diagnosis. And the two authors are Dr. Sammy Winemaker and Dr. Sien Xiao. They are palliative care physicians in Canada. So I also have them on the resource list, and they'll be on the show notes. I often hand out the 7 keys to a lot of my clients as they come in, because it's a nice resource. And actually I had the handout before the book came out this year. They are now creating a handbook that I'm really looking forward to being able to teach out of. So,
and Kathy, would you say this book is appropriate for both the person who's going through the cancer diagnosis and the caregiver?
Yes, yes, because it provokes a lot of questions and answers and takes people through a process. And I've had people say this was so helpful, and there's a number of stories in it that illustrate. So it kind of takes us to knowing and it's like there are parts where you're zooming out. What's the bigger picture of this? And what are some questions I should be asking? There's also what's kind of my caregiver style? We've got some people who are very, I've got people come in, they've got notebooks and they're prepared with everything and they can call everything up, or somebody who just does that differently, whatever their thing is, but to understand, how am I doing this? What other things can support me? So and they have a fabulous podcast. If you like podcasts,
Okay.
they're just started their 9th season. And
is the podcast called the same thing? Hope for the
it's
best.
called Waiting Room Revolution.
Okay.
That's the name of their website. So there's a revolution going on out there about
Well, I will.
in the most positive way possible.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I've got a question, just something I've always thought about when it comes to, you might call it end of days, but,
Yes.
and it's appropriate really with cancer, because there are certain types of cancer. It's just a roll of the dice. It's unexplainable why you got it. It just happened and you have to deal with it. There's another kind of cancer where you probably had a role in it. And I'm thinking an easy one would be tobacco. It was my smoking that killed me, that put me here. Two different types of way of looking at end of days, so to speak. Two different types of grief. One, I think, might be really bad, would be for me. I did this to myself. And so I really feel badly about that. Do you encounter that?
I would say, I think sometimes because I don't work as much with patients as I do caregivers, but if this is the person who's coming to me with that, I think my desire is to help relieve people of burdens. I don't want people leaving this life carrying guilt or shame or anything like that. And sometimes our beliefs, I think that's sometimes where the guilt comes from is our beliefs about I should have done this, I shouldn't have done this. And some beliefs are at a higher level that we can work at, and others are so on the unconscious. But I don't know. If that's what's happening for somebody and they're thinking like, oh, I brought this on myself, and then okay, so if there's a recognition that this or that I could have perhaps controlled was a contributing factor, then okay, that can be acknowledged, but where's the place for that? And then where is the bigger place for someone's more whole life and their wholeness?
And self-compassion.
Yes, and self-forgiveness.
And statistically, most people who smoke don't get cancer, but it's still like, it's not illegal, it's not immoral, it's, we all have vices, and so the question resonates with me because both my mom and dad died of cigarette smoking. My mom died of lung cancer, and my dad died of sudden cardiac death. And they grew up at a time where smoking was over 50% of individuals smoked. And I would say that I personally don't blame them for having left me orphaned because they chose to smoke. And so I think that even whether we have a role to play by engaging in behavior that has risks, I think there's a way of giving yourself compassion and not carrying around this blame, and especially not then passing on that blame to the surviving family members.
Yeah, I think that's my father was a smoker, because as you say, everyone was smoking back in the days. It's like those were gifts people gave to people. They brought you an ashtray, yay. And then my mother died when I was very young. So my mom died at 42 of breast cancer. And then my father had been a smoker, and he was about 44. And so he had 5 kids to raise, and he was pretty stressed out, but he quit smoking. So he quit smoking in his 40s, but he still ended up developing COPD and asthma. He died at 79. But he would say to me at times, because we had lots of good conversations, he would say, I'm so sorry that I did that. He said, but we just didn't know any different at the time. We just, he said, I hate that I smoked in people's houses, but it's like everyone was smoking in people's houses. I know somebody young listening to
Yeah.
this is going to be like, what are you talking about?
So,
But yeah, so I think it's like, no, it's like, it's okay. It's okay. And to, not carry that.
And how do you respond to a caregiver that comes to you and says, they're too young? This isn't right. It's not fair. And particularly the age factor, because as I get older, I happen to think that part of it almost isn't fair. If you're 89, as an example, 90 can look pretty good.
Yeah.
There's no reason that you should just cash because you're 89. Why give up? But what do you tell a caregiver that really feels defeated because their loved one, in their mind anyway, is just too young and they're getting gypped, for a better term?
It's a lot of holding of all of those sentiments. It's a lot of mirroring back. Yes, this is unfair. Using whatever language they're bringing, and acknowledging it so that it's not like we don't want to get locked up in toxic positivity and say like, oh, it's okay or whatever. It's like, no, like it is tragic, because the other thing too that a lot of people, particularly when you have a younger person, people are grieving the life that this person will not have, the opportunities that they will not have, which is also sometimes the grief of some of my other clients that like, I get to plan ahead and they don't. And it doesn't add up. It's like, it's not supposed to be like this. And there are no good answers
there are
for
no
anybody.
answers. There are
It's just holding
answers.
that
It's
pain.
coming to realize that each of our paths is filled with bumps, and how can we feel better, and how can we bring joy into our life? And often at that time, it's to stop ruminating over this non-solvable problem and to reach out and do something for someone else. So you're never going to resolve the fact that someone who died at age 24 was way too young to die. Not solvable. But you don't have to think about that every single second of the day, and finding what brings joy into your life. And often that is bringing joy into someone else's life.
Right. And not feeling guilty when you stopped thinking of them for that moment and you had joy. And it's like, it's like you can hold both.
Yes.
It's possible to hold both.
And
with help
yes.
and with time. Yeah.
And the person who died would never want that you wear black and are miserable for the rest of your life in some sort of an honor to the one who died.
Yeah,
They would want you to live your life and find joy.
Yeah.
Other questions? Last question comes from Sherry.
Okay, so back to the smoking. As a caregiver, that their person that is terminal is smoking, I think they want them to quit right now. There's a fine line in between what you want and what their right as a person is. How would you direct someone on that?
Let me share with you. So my mom, when she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer in her late 40s, did not stop smoking. My dad did stop smoking, and Mom chose not to. And she was physically addicted to it and had an incurable cancer. And I would say we approached it with that was a decision she could make. Back then, we weren't thinking about secondhand smoking and all of the other issues that might be related. I think it's still okay for family members to set boundaries. I mean, just because mom is dying of cancer and wants to smoke, it doesn't mean that she gets to smoke in the kids' homes or in places that are inappropriate. But so I think you approach it with compassion and understanding, and realizing truly that by the time someone has developed cancer, if it's an early stage, stopping smoking can help benefit their health. If it's late stage, it could help benefit their health, but it's not worth fighting over or causing discontent. That would just be my own practical way. I'd advise patients to stop, but I'm certainly not, and provide the opportunity, provide the resources, but don't try to put a guilt trip on them.
Yeah. And I think too, if you can find a way, because of course the natural thing is like, no, why don't you stop? Because we want to save them. Then that's the natural urge. Like, can we do something about this? I'm trying to help you and you're just smoking or whatever. It's like sometimes being able to step back and find a different strategy or a different mindset about it and maybe leave the room or do so you don't feel like I'm participating in this. Did I add to this? However complex that is. But it's a good question because it's a complicated one.
Right. And you don't just have to go to smoking. I mean, it's our eating habits, our drinking habits, our lack of physical activity habits, our, a lack of good sleep. There's so many things that are complicated. And, how do we, most of us here would get an A on the written test for what we should do to stay healthy and what we shouldn't do. But most of us fail miserably on the practical test from time to time. So we are human.
Yeah.
Well, Kathy, this has been wonderful. Thank you
you
for
so
all
much.
you do for our patients, for their family members. I really appreciate it. You make a huge
Thank you.
difference in their lives.
Well, it's my pleasure. I enjoy it. Thank you for the opportunity.
And if any of you watching know someone that would benefit by watching this program, it is going to be available on demand beginning tomorrow at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel and also the Mercy One Cancer Center website. I hope you'll join us again next week. Thanks. Thanks, Kathy.